He was 20 years old when he became king of Macedon, 25 when he shattered the Persian Empire, 28 when he stood at the edge of the known world and wept, not from grief but because there was nothing left to conquer. And then, at 32, in a palace in Babylon, surrounded by the greatest army the ancient world had ever seen, Alexander the Great lay down on a couch, closed his eyes, and died. No sword reached him, no assassin found him. No rival general outmaneuvered him on the field of battle. Something far older, far more patient, far more absolute than any human enemy waited for him at the end of his road. And when it came, it took everything. The Conqueror, the dynasty he never secured, and the empire he had spent his entire life bleeding to build. This is not simply a story about war. This is a story about the collision between unlimited human ambition and the one force that has never, in all of recorded history, surrendered to it. This is the story of the man who conquered the world, and the world that conquered him back. If stories like this are what you live for, subscribe to the channel right now. More await. He was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon, a kingdom that most Greeks of the era regarded with polite condescension. A rough northern state on the fringes of Hellenic civilization, its people considered half barbarian by the sophisticated citizens of Athens and Corinth. His father was Philip II, a king of extraordinary military and diplomatic genius who had, over the preceding 2 decades, transformed Macedon from a fractured, vulnerable territory into the dominant power in the Greek world. His mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus, a woman of ferocious intelligence, deep religious mysticism, and an ambition that matched and perhaps exceeded her husband's. From the very first hours of Alexander's life, the mythology had already begun. Ancient sources record that on the night of his birth, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Priests interpreted the sign immediately. The goddess had been away from her temple, attending the birth of a future conqueror. Whether the story is true is almost beside the point. The ancient world believed it, and crucially, Alexander believed it too. Olympias told her son from his earliest years that his true father was not Philip of Macedon, but Zeus himself, king of the gods who had visited her in the night. She pointed to his lineage through Achilles on her side of the family, through Heracles on Philip's. She raised him on Homer. She raised him on the Iliad. She raised him on the intoxicating idea that the greatest thing a man could do with his life was to burn bright and fast and leave a name that echoed forever, even if the life itself was short. In another household, with another mother, these might have been bedtime stories. For Alexander, they became operating instructions. Philip, for his part, understood that a prince of Macedon required more than myth. He required rigor, and so in 343 BCE, when Alexander was 13 years old, Philip brought to the royal court a man named Aristotle, already recognized as one of the greatest minds alive, a former student of Plato, a philosopher whose intellectual range encompassed biology, physics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and the nature of the cosmos itself. Philip is said to have written to Aristotle, "I have a son. I wish him to be taught by you rather than anyone else. I would rather he excel in wisdom than surpass all others in power." Aristotle accepted. For 3 years in a garden sanctuary called Mieza, the philosopher and the prince worked together, and the education that resulted shaped everything that followed. Aristotle taught Alexander to question. He taught him to observe the natural world with precision and curiosity. He gave him a copy of the Iliad, which Philip had annotated, and Alexander reportedly kept it with him for the rest of his life, sleeping with it beneath his pillow alongside a dagger. But Aristotle also taught him something more dangerous, the concept that greatness was not merely inherited or gifted by the gods. It was achieved. It was built through action, through virtue expressed in the world, through the accumulation of deeds that outlasted the body that performed them. Between Olympius and Aristotle, between divine destiny and philosophical ambition, Alexander was forged into something the ancient world had no framework to contain. He was not simply a soldier, he was not simply a statesman, he was a man who genuinely believed, with every sinew of his being, that he was meant to exceed every human being who had ever lived. And that belief was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was a kind of sacred obligation. To be less than the greatest was, for Alexander, a form of failure so complete it bordered on sacrilege. The early signs arrived before he was even a teenager. At age 10, he tamed a horse named Bucephalus that no adult handler could control, reading the animal's fear of its own shadow, turning it toward the sun, and mounting it before anyone could stop him. Philip, watching, is said to have wept with pride and declared that Macedon was too small for him. At 16, while Philip was away on campaign, Alexander served as regent and suppressed a rebellion in Thrace, founding his first city on the site, naming it Alexandropolis. He was 16 years old. He was already naming places after himself. In 340 BCE, he fought his first real battle alongside Philip at the siege of Byzantium. In 338, at the Battle of Chaeronea, the 18-year-old prince commanded the left wing of the Macedonian army in a decisive engagement against a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. The Theban sacred band, an elite force of 150 pairs of male lovers considered unbreakable because they would never abandon each other, stood in his path. Alexander broke them. Every single one of them died where they stood. He reportedly visited the site afterward and wept, not from regret, from admiration. These were men, he understood, who had chosen a glorious death over an inglorious retreat. It was exactly what he would have done. And then Philip was murdered. In 336 BCE, at a celebration in the Macedonian capital, Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The motives remain disputed to this day. Personal grievance, political conspiracy, a possibly foreign influence. The ancient sources point in several directions simultaneously, and some of them point obliquely toward Olympius, toward Alexander himself. The truth is buried deep beneath 24 centuries of silence, and it may never be recovered. What is certain is this: Philip's death created a vacuum, and Alexander moved to fill it with a speed that left no one time to organize an alternative. He was 20 years old. He had no experience as a sole ruler. He had rivals, half-brothers with claims to the throne, Macedonian nobles with armies of their own, Greek city-states that immediately sensed an opportunity. Athens celebrated openly when Philip died. Thebes began plotting to expel its Macedonian garrison. The northern tribes beyond Macedon's borders stirred with renewed restlessness. From every direction, the wolves were circling a young king who had inherited a superpower and had not yet proven he could hold it. What followed was a masterclass in the application of overwhelming force at overwhelming speed. Alexander moved north first, crushing the Thracian and Illyrian tribes before they could consolidate. He moved south through Greece like a controlled storm, arriving at Thebes before the city fully understood that he was coming. When Thebes resisted, he destroyed it, utterly, methodically, without hesitation. 6,000 Theban citizens were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city was leveled to the ground, every building demolished except, according to ancient accounts, the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander revered. It was a message calculated with lethal precision: resist me, and I will erase you from the earth. Cooperate and I will honor your culture. The choice was not complicated. Greece went quiet. Corinth convened a congress and declared Alexander the leader of the Hellenic League, the successor to his father's plans for war against Persia. He visited Corinth and, according to a story that may be apocryphal but is too revealing to ignore, met the philosopher Diogenes, a man famous for living in a barrel and rejecting all conventional ambition. Alexander stood before him and asked if there was anything he could do for the philosopher. Diogenes, lying in the sun, replied, "Stand out of my light." Alexander turned to his companions and said that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. The anecdote captures something essential about him. He genuinely understood the critique of everything he was doing. He simply could not stop doing it. He did not want to stop. The drive was not neurotic compulsion. It was chosen, embraced, celebrated. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, at the head of an army of approximately 47,000 men. It was a deliberate act of mythological theater as much as military strategy. He threw his spear into the Asian shore as he approached, claiming the continent as territory won by the spear. He stopped at Troy, the legendary site of the war that had produced his hero Achilles, and made offerings at the hero's tomb. He ran a race around the monument, naked, anointed with oil, in the ancient tradition of honoring the dead. He wanted Achilles to know he was coming. He wanted the gods to know he intended to exceed even that legendary standard. The Persian Empire he was about to invade was the largest political entity on earth. It stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, encompassing the territories of modern-day Turkey, Egypt, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It had existed for over 2 centuries. It had armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It had wealth that made Macedon look like a provincial backwater. Its king, Darius III, commanded resources that Alexander could not conceivably match in a direct war of attrition. Alexander did not fight a war of attrition. At the Granicus River in May of 334, the Persian forces positioned themselves on the far bank, the current running swift and steep, anticipating that the Macedonians would hesitate. Alexander did not hesitate. He led the charge himself directly into the river, directly at the heaviest concentration of Persian cavalry, directly into the most dangerous point of contact. It was tactically aggressive to the point of recklessness, and it worked. In the chaos of close combat, 2 Persian nobles came within seconds of killing him. One nearly took his head from his shoulders with a curved blade before a companion officer killed the Persian first. Alexander emerged from the Granicus victorious, and the narrative of invincibility began its first chapter. He moved through Anatolia rapidly, liberating Greek coastal cities that had been under Persian control, treating them as allies rather than subjects, but carefully managing the political theater of every arrival. When he reached the Gordian knot, a legendary tangle of rope that, according to prophecy, could only be undone by the man destined to rule Asia, he did not spend days attempting to find the hidden end. He drew his sword and cut straight through it. Whether this was inspiration or impatience was, again, beside the point. The image it projected was everything. This man does not work within the rules of your world. He rewrites them. At Issus in 333 BCE, Darius himself took the field, commanding an army that vastly outnumbered Alexander's forces. Persian generals had advised Darius to use the open plains of Mesopotamia, where his numbers could be fully deployed. Darius instead chose a narrow coastal battlefield, possibly attempting to deny Alexander room to maneuver. And it proved catastrophic. In the decisive moment of the battle, Alexander identified Darius's position in the Persian rear, and drove directly toward it at the head of the companion cavalry. Darius, watching the Macedonian line tear through his forces with impossible speed and directness, broke. He fled the field in his chariot, abandoning his army, his baggage, and, in one of history's most devastating details, his own family. His mother, his wife, and his daughters were captured and taken to Alexander's camp. What Alexander did next is worth pausing on. He visited the captured Persian royal women personally and guaranteed their safety. He treated Darius's mother, Sisigambis, with extraordinary deference, allegedly bowing to her, treating her as a queen, addressing her with the respect due her station. He reportedly told her that he had not taken her family. He had claimed a kingdom. The gesture was not simple kindness. It was sophisticated political understanding. He was not merely defeating Persia, he was preparing to become its ruler. And rulers of Persia commanded their subjects through a legitimacy that required the appearance of divine sanction and royal dignity. From the very beginning, Alexander was thinking beyond the battle. Darius, retreating, sent envoys offering peace terms. He would cede all territories west of the Euphrates and pay an enormous ransom for his family's return. One of Alexander's senior generals, Parmenion, reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept the offer. Alexander's reply became famous. "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The message was unambiguous. The terms were rejected. The campaign would not stop. He moved south into the Levant, laying siege to the city of Tyre, an island fortress considered essentially impregnable. And when the Tyrians refused to surrender, he built a causeway across the sea to reach them. It took 7 months. It required the demolition of the old mainland city of Tyre to provide the building materials. When the siege finally broke the walls, Alexander's treatment of the defenders was merciless. 2,000 Tyrian men were crucified along the beach. 8,000 were killed in the fighting. 30,000 were sold into slavery. It was a pattern already visible at Thebes, and it would grow more pronounced as the campaign continued. Mercy for those who submitted, annihilation for those who defied. The mathematics of conquest. Egypt received him as a liberator. The Persian governors had ruled Egypt harshly, interfering with local religious practice and treating the ancient civilization with the contempt of occupiers. Alexander arrived and did the opposite. He visited the temple of Ptah at Memphis, made offerings in the Egyptian tradition, presented himself within the framework of Egyptian religious legitimacy. In the spring of 331 BCE, he made a journey that stands as one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire campaign. A pilgrimage across the desert to the remote oracle of Amun at Siwa. The journey was brutal. Days through waterless desert, the party reportedly guided by ravens or serpents, depending on which ancient source you trust. At Siwa, the oracle greeted him as the son of Amun, the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus, confirming what Olympias had always told him. When asked what the oracle had said, Alexander replied only that he had heard what his heart desired. What he heard, or what he told people he heard, fundamentally altered the internal architecture of his self-conception. He had always believed in his divine heritage. Now he had divine confirmation, delivered by a priest of one of the most ancient and respected oracles in the world. He was not merely a king, he was a god's son. And that belief, nurtured by his mother since childhood, validated by the oracle of Siwa, would drive him further east and further into isolation from the men around him than any military setback ever could. Before leaving Egypt, he founded a city on the Mediterranean coast and named it Alexandria. It would become, within a generation, the greatest city in the known world, home to the famous library, a cosmopolitan center of learning and trade and philosophy that bore his name for centuries. He would found dozens of cities across his campaign, all named Alexandria, or named after his horse Bucephalus, or named after some local variant of his own mythology. The compulsion to stamp his name on the geography of the world was not incidental, it was the point. He understood, with the clarity that comes from having been raised on Homer, that men die, but names endure. In 331 BCE, at Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq, the final confrontation with Darius III played out on a massive scale. Darius had prepared the battlefield carefully this time, leveling the ground so his scythed chariots could operate freely, assembling an army so large that ancient estimates, almost certainly exaggerated, place it at 1,000,000 men. Modern historians suggest the real number may have been between 200,000 and 500,000. Against this, Alexander had perhaps 47,000. The night before the battle, Parmenion suggested a night attack to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander refused. He would not, he said, steal a victory. He wanted it in full daylight, in plain sight, so there could be no question about what happened. The Battle of Gaugamela is studied in military academies to this day. Alexander allowed the Persian lines to stretch and thin as they attempted to envelop his flanks, then identified the gap that opened in the Persian center and drove straight through it at maximum speed at the head of the companion cavalry, aiming directly at Darius. Once again Darius fled. This time he fled deeper into the Persian heartland, and this time there would be no recovery. His own nobles turned on him. A Bactrian satrap named Bessus, part of the Persian inner circle, eventually captured Darius and, as Alexander's forces closed in, stabbed him and left him dying beside the road. When Alexander's outriders found the body of the Persian king, they covered it with a royal cloak and sent it back for burial with honors. Alexander presented himself as the rightful heir of the Achaemenid dynasty, the avenger of Darius's murder, the legitimate successor to the greatest empire on earth. The theatrics were immaculate. Now the reality was that he had simply won. He burned Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, in what ancient sources describe as either a deliberate act of symbolic closure, marking the formal end of the Persian Wars that had begun when Xerxes burned Athens a century and a half earlier, or a drunken decision he later regretted. Perhaps both things were true simultaneously. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in modern Iran, and the blackened stones of the palace still bear the evidence of that night. Fire, it turns out, leaves marks that last longer than empires. He was now, at 25 years old, the ruler of the largest empire the world had seen. Most men would have stopped. Most men would have consolidated, administered, built institutions, secured succession, and lived as long as the laws of probability allowed. Alexander was not most men. He turned east. Here is where the story begins to change texture. Here is where the light starts to shift from gold to something darker and more ambiguous. The Persian campaign had a narrative logic to it. It was the fulfillment of Philip's plans, the revenge of Greece, the liberation of Persian subjects from Achaemenid rule. The campaign east of Persia had no such framework. It was something closer to pure compulsion. The further he went, the harder the justification became to articulate, and the harder it became to articulate, the more Alexander seemed to feel the need to demonstrate that the gods had ordained it. The first signs of internal fracture appeared in Bactria and Sogdia, the territories corresponding to modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, where the campaign ground down into a brutal guerrilla war that dragged on for 3 years. The terrain was unforgiving. The enemy was elusive, dispersed, refusing pitched battle, striking and vanishing into mountains and desert. Supply lines stretched to their breaking point. Men died of thirst and cold in landscapes utterly unlike the Mediterranean world they had come from. For the first time in the campaign, Alexander could not simply apply superior tactics on an open field and produce a decisive result. Victory required patience, endurance, and a willingness to accept grinding attrition, qualities that did not sit easily with a man built entirely around speed and decisiveness. It was during this period, in 328 BCE, at a banquet in the city of Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand, that Alexander killed Cleitus the Black. Cleitus was one of his oldest companions, the officer who had saved his life at the Granicus River. At the banquet, drunk and angry, Cleitus began insulting Alexander publicly, mocking the divine pretensions, suggesting that Alexander's victories owed more to his father Philip and his Macedonian veterans than to any divine intervention. Alexander, equally drunk, seized a spear from one of his guards and drove it through Cleitus's chest. The silence that followed must have been absolute. Alexander immediately recognized what he had done. By ancient accounts, he attempted to turn the spear on himself and had to be physically restrained by his bodyguards. He retreated to his tent for 3 days of what appears to have been genuine psychological collapse. Refusing food, refusing visitors, alternating between grief and self-recrimination. His philosophical advisors eventually coaxed him back to function by arguing that as a king and the son of a god, he was above the ordinary moral frameworks that governed lesser men. It was, in its way, the worst possible advice. It reinforced precisely the logic that had made the murder possible in the first place. If you want to be the first to know when we release stories like this, subscribe. It takes only a second. The execution of Philotas and Parmenion followed shortly after, in 330 BCE. Philotas was the son of Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced and senior general, and was accused of concealing knowledge of a plot against Alexander's life. Whether Philotas was genuinely guilty is a question historians have debated for centuries. What is not debated is that he was tortured until he confessed and then executed. See, what is also not debated is that Alexander, recognizing that Parmenion, commanding a key garrison in Persia with a substantial army, might seek revenge for his son's death, sent messengers ahead by fast horse to kill the general before the news could reach him. Parmenion was murdered without trial, without accusation, without the formality of even a fabricated charge. He was killed because he was dangerous and because Alexander feared him. The man who had served Philip II for decades, who had stood at Alexander's side from the beginning of the campaign, who had arguably made Macedonian victory possible with his steady command of the infantry, was executed in secret because his king was afraid. This was a different Alexander than the one who had stood before Thebes or leapt into the Granicus. This was a man whose certainty in his own divine destiny had metastasized into something that no longer distinguished clearly between loyalty and threat. The paranoia had rational components. He was, after all, ruling vast territories with commanders who controlled significant independent forces, and betrayal was a real historical risk for any ancient king. But the executions went beyond strategic calculation. They had the quality of fear. The adoption of Persian court customs deepened the alienation from his Macedonian core. Alexander began requiring the Persian practice of proskinesis, a bow or prostration before the king, from his Macedonian and Greek companions, men who came from a culture where such gestures were reserved for the gods. The Macedonians resisted with a mixture of discomfort and contempt. One of Alexander's closest intellectual companions, Callisthenes, nephew of Aristotle, the campaign's official historian, refused publicly and apparently said things that suggested the demand was not merely foreign but impious. He was subsequently arrested on charges of involvement in a conspiracy of royal pages and died in captivity, either executed or from illness while imprisoned. His guilt, like Philotas's, remains historically uncertain. His inconvenience to Alexander is beyond question. And yet, alongside this darkening portrait, the capacity for extraordinary magnanimity persisted in strange coexistence. Alexander fell genuinely in love, by all ancient accounts, with a Bactrian noblewoman named Roxane, the daughter of a local chieftain, and married her in 327 BCE, not as a political transaction but with the full ceremony and cultural weight of a genuine marriage. He had taken Persian royal concubines but treated them with remarkable restraint for an ancient conqueror. His relationship with his closest companion, Hephaestion, whom he had known since childhood and who was, by most scholarly interpretation, the great emotional constant of his life, was apparently characterized by a depth of feeling that exceeded any other bond he maintained. He was capable of extraordinary loyalty. He was capable of extraordinary cruelty. These were not contradictions. They were the same force moving in different directions. In 327 BCE, he crossed the Hindu Kush into the Indian subcontinent, territory entirely beyond the eastern boundary of the Persian Empire, by territory that no Greek or Macedonian army had ever entered. He was now operating in a world that had no place in Greek geography, mythology, or imagination. The kingdoms of the Punjab were not part of any narrative he had been given. He was writing entirely new myth in real time. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, he fought what many military historians consider his most brilliant battle, against King Porus of the Pauravas, who commanded war elephants that terrified even veteran Macedonian cavalry. The horses refused to approach the animals. Alexander spent days conducting feints and diversions before crossing the river in darkness and storm, catching Porus partially deployed, attacking from an unexpected direction, and forcing an engagement on his own terms. The battle was brutal and close. At its end, Porus stood wounded but upright, still fighting, refusing to surrender until he could no longer physically continue. When the captured Porus was brought before Alexander, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus answered, "Like a king." Alexander looked at him for a long moment and then restored his kingdom, added territory to it, and made him an ally. The gesture was strategically sound. It established a client kingdom that could anchor Macedonian influence in the region. But it was also something more. It was the recognition from one king to another of a quality that Alexander genuinely respected above almost everything else: dignity maintained under absolute duress. But the army was finished. The men had been marching for 8 years. They had crossed the Hellespont as young soldiers with Greek grudges against Persia and a brilliant young king who seemed genuinely touched by the gods. They had fought at Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, through the 3 grinding years in Bactria, over the Hindu Kush, into India. They were in a monsoon climate unlike anything they had experienced, fighting enemies who used weapons and tactics they had never trained against, losing men to disease and exhaustion and the slow accumulation of wounds that every battle season added to the sum total of damage a body can absorb. And Alexander wanted to keep going. He had received reports that beyond the Hyphasis River lay the kingdom of the Ganges, a vast empire of extraordinary wealth. He believed, because his cosmological model, derived partly from Aristotle and partly from his own mythological framework, that beyond the Ganges lay the edge of the world, the outer ocean, the place where he could finally plant his spear in the earth's last shore and declare the whole world his. He was 30 years old. He had been at war for 11 years, counting the earliest Macedonian campaigns. He could not stop. The stopping was not in him. His generals came to him one by one. They spoke of disease among the troops, of supply failures, of rivers ahead, swollen with monsoon rains. of kingdoms larger and better prepared than anything they had yet encountered. They spoke of home, of wives and children and farms and aging parents who had not seen them in nearly a decade. Conus, one of the most senior and trusted commanders, I delivered what ancient sources describe as a remarkable speech on behalf of the assembled veterans. He spoke with tears. He spoke of the dead, of the men left in graves scattered across 12,000 miles of campaign. He spoke of the living who had given everything and had a right to see what they had fought for. Alexander dismissed the meeting and went to his tent. For 3 days he refused to emerge. He sacrificed to the gods, seeking omens that would justify continuing. The omens reportedly were unfavorable. He came out of his tent and announced that they would turn back. The men cheered with a joy that ancient sources describe as overwhelming, weeping, laughing, calling down blessings on their king for the first time in years. Alexander did not join the celebration. He had been told no by the force that he could not fight. He could not outmaneuver, could not destroy or absorb or transform through will. For the first time in his life, he had reached a limit that was not Persian, not geographic, not geological, but human. He raised 12 enormous altars at the Hyphasis River, one for each of the Olympian gods, marking the eastern limit of his empire. They were built on a scale larger than anything a human army should have been able to construct, because he needed even this retreat to be a monument. And then he turned west, toward Babylon, toward the administrative center of the empire he had built and had spent almost no time actually governing. The return journey was catastrophic. He chose to lead part of the army back through the Gedrosian Desert, the Makran coast in modern Pakistan, a route that may have been chosen as a deliberate act of mythological competition, since both the legendary conquerors Semiramis and Cyrus the Great had attempted the crossing and reportedly failed or suffered enormous losses. If so, it was the most tragic expression of competitive hubris in the entire campaign. The desert destroyed the army. There was no water, there was no food. The heat was annihilating. Soldiers died in their thousands, not in battle, not from wounds, but from thirst and starvation and exhaustion, their bodies simply surrendering on the march. Women and children who had followed the campaign fell alongside the soldiers. What ancient sources suggest that 3/4 of the force that entered the Gedrosian Desert did not emerge on the other side. Modern historians debate the numbers, but even the most conservative estimates indicate that the crossing cost Alexander more lives than many of his battles combined. He had made a decision that killed tens of thousands of his own people. The logic behind it, if there was a logic beyond the compulsion to exceed all predecessors, remains one of the darkest questions surrounding his legacy. He emerged from the desert and punished the governors who had failed to supply the route adequately. Several were executed. He seems to have understood at some level that the disaster required accountability, and he directed that accountability outward toward the administrators rather than inward, toward the choice that had made their failure lethal. Hephaestion died in Ecbatana in 324 BCE from illness, possibly typhoid, possibly excessive drinking, possibly a combination of both. Alexander's grief was so extreme that contemporary accounts compare it to Achilles mourning Patroclus. The Homeric parallel he had been living his entire life, finally arriving in its darkest form. He reportedly lay over the body for hours, refusing to be moved. He ordered the manes of the army's horses and mules cut in mourning. He crucified the physician who had failed to save Hephaestion. He requested that the oracle at Siwa declare Hephaestion a divine hero, a request the oracle granted. He ordered a funeral pyre in Babylon to cost the equivalent of 10,000 talents, a sum so astronomical it staggers historical comprehension. The pyre was reportedly 5 stories tall, decorated with gilded eagles, lions, bulls, and armaments, and built to be visible from every direction across the flat plain of Babylonia. But Alexander could not build it in time to see it burn. In the spring of 323 BCE, he arrived in Babylon. He had plans, extraordinary, restless, compulsive plans, because his mind never stopped generating campaigns. He wanted to circumnavigate Arabia. He wanted to explore the Caspian Sea. There are accounts of plans to campaign west toward Carthage and Spain and the unknown reaches of the Mediterranean world. He was 32 years old, and the plans were multiplying faster than the years to accomplish them. He began preparing the fleet for the Arabian expedition. He attended banquets, made offerings. Received ambassadors from every corner of the world who came to Babylon as though it were already the center of a new global order, because it was. In late May, he attended a drinking party hosted by one of his companions, a Macedonian named Medius of Larissa. He drank heavily. He woke the next morning with a fever. He continued his administrative duties for several days. Ancient accounts show him conducting meetings, making sacrifices, issuing orders, while the fever climbed. He was moved to the palace near the gardens by the Euphrates. He began to lose his voice. He lost the ability to speak. His Macedonian soldiers, hearing rumors that he was dying or already dead, demanded to see him. The doors of the palace were opened, and the veterans filed through one by one, past their king's bed. Alexander, unable to speak, recognized each man and greeted them with his eyes, raising his head slightly or lifting a hand in acknowledgement. Men who had marched 12,000 miles beside him, who had survived Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela and the Hindu Kush and the Gedrosian desert, walked past his bed and wept. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, historians still debate the precise date, Alexander III of Macedon died. He was 32 years and 8 months old. He had reigned for 13 years. He had campaigned continuously for 11 of them. He had never lost a battle. When his generals gathered around him in the final hours and asked to whom he left his empire, his answer, if the ancient sources accurately preserve it, was either to the strongest or to the best. Some sources suggest he was too far gone to answer coherently at all. Some suggest he handed his signet ring to his general Perdiccas, designating him as regent without naming him as successor. The ambiguity was total. The silence at the center of the succession was absolute. He had spent 13 years making himself irreplaceable. He had given no thought, or perhaps given desperate, inadequate thought, to what happened when the irreplaceable was removed. What followed his death has the quality of a Greek tragedy played out across continental scale. His generals, men called the Diadochi, the successors, began fighting almost immediately. His unborn child by Roxane, born months after his death and named Alexander IV, was recognized as king but held no real power. His half-brother Aridaeus, Philip III, was also proclaimed king. He appears to have had some kind of cognitive disability, making him easily manipulated. For the next 40 years, the generals tore the empire apart in a series of wars of extraordinary violence and complexity. Perdiccas was murdered. Antipater died of illness. Craterus died in battle against Eumenes. Antigonus fell at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE. Lysimachus died at the Battle of Corupedium in 281. Seleucus was murdered. Ptolemy survived and established a dynasty in Egypt that lasted until Cleopatra. Cassander, the son of Antipater, had both Roxane and the young Alexander IV executed quietly, without fanfare, ending the direct Argead bloodline entirely. The last heir of Alexander the Great was murdered in a prison cell as a teenager. The empire he had bled for was not divided. It was shredded. By 275 BCE, a mere 50 years after his death. The unified Macedonian Empire existed nowhere on earth. In its place were competing Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedon itself under the Antigonids, the Near East and Persia under the Seleucids, Egypt under the Ptolemies, constantly at war with each other, a patchwork of Greek-influenced states that maintained his cultural legacy while destroying his political one. But the legend grew. It grew with the speed and organic inevitability of something that fills a vacuum created by its own absence. Stories about Alexander multiplied, were embellished, were invented, were attached to earlier stories about other conquerors and attributed to him, were translated into Persian and Arabic and Syriac and Coptic and Hebrew and Ethiopian, and eventually into virtually every literary tradition on earth. He appears in the Quran, unnamed but clearly recognizable as the traveler Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one. He appears in medieval European romances as a figure of chivalric virtue. He appears in Persian poetry as a philosopher king, a seeker of the fountain of youth. The historical Alexander, complicated, violent, brilliant, driven by compulsions he could neither name nor resist, dissolved into a mythological vessel that different cultures filled with whatever they most needed, a supreme hero to represent. He has been claimed by the Greeks and the Macedonians and the Egyptians and the Iranians and the Afghans and the Pakistanis, all of whom can point to genuine historical connections to his campaigns. He has been claimed by soldiers who wanted a model of military genius, and by philosophers who wanted a model of enlightened rule, and by politicians who wanted a model of civilizational ambition. He has been analyzed by historians and psychologists, and military theorists and literary critics for more than 2,000 years, and the analysis continues, because the figure at the center of the story keeps refusing to resolve into a simple lesson, because the simple lesson that power corrupts, that hubris destroys, that mortality humbles the mighty, is not quite adequate to what actually happened. The corruption was real, but so was the generosity. The hubris was real, but so was the genuine philosophical curiosity, the respect for Porus, the care for Hephaestion, the tears over the Theban sacred band. So the mortality was absolute. He died at 32 with no secured successor and no stable empire. But what he left behind was not nothing. The world that emerged from his campaigns was genuinely different from the world that preceded them. Greek language and culture spread across a territory that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, creating the Hellenistic world that would in turn shape the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Golden Age, and through these the foundations of modern Western and Middle Eastern civilization. Alexandria, the city he named for himself, built on a strip of Egyptian coastline in what seemed like a casual impulse, became for 2 centuries the intellectual capital of the known world. The Library of Alexandria, now whatever its exact nature and the truth behind its legendary destruction, represents something real. The aspiration planted by Alexander's campaign and nurtured by his successors to gather all human knowledge in one place. The aspiration was his. The achievement was what survived him. And so we arrive at the question that the evidence refuses to answer cleanly. Was Alexander's greatness a function of what he accomplished, or of what he attempted? His empire lasted his lifetime, plus roughly 50 years before fragmenting completely. His dynasty lasted his lifetime, plus perhaps 10 before his son was murdered. His body was placed in a magnificent gold sarcophagus, carried to Egypt, and eventually housed in Alexandria, where it became an object of pilgrimage for centuries, visited by Julius Caesar, by Augustus, by Caligula, and then disappeared. No one knows with any certainty where Alexander's body is today. The man who named a dozen cities after himself, who left his signet ring as the only inheritance he could manage, who was recognized as divine by oracles in 3 different religious traditions, whose face was reproduced on more coins than any other figure in the ancient world. His body is gone. His tomb is lost. The physical remains of the greatest conqueror in history cannot be located. There is something in that vanishing that feels, in retrospect, like the point. He was never going to be contained in a tomb. He was never going to be fixed in one place, reduced to bones and dust in a structure that could be visited and mapped and definitively known. The legend required the mystery. The mythology required the disappearance. Gods do not have tombs that archaeologists can excavate. Gods do not have bodies that university laboratories can carbon date. If Alexander genuinely believed himself to be the son of Zeus, and the evidence strongly suggests he did, whatever philosophical qualifications he might have attached to that belief, then perhaps the vanishing of his remains is the most consistent thing that ever happened to him. The fever that took him in Babylon remains medically disputed. Typhoid fever, the leading modern hypothesis, would explain the 12-day progression, the high temperature, the ascending paralysis that may have immobilized his limbs before his death, the gastrointestinal symptoms recorded in the ancient sources. But there are other hypotheses. West Nile virus, which was endemic in Mesopotamian marshes and can produce identical neurological symptoms. Poisoning, a theory ancient sources themselves raise, and which has been intermittently revived, though most historians find it unlikely. Acute pancreatitis exacerbated by chronic heavy drinking. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and we likely never will. What we know is that whatever it was not an army, it was not a king, it was not a divine rival, or a betrayal by trusted companions, or a mutiny by exhausted soldiers. It was small, it was invisible. It entered his body by some ordinary vector, a mosquito bite, contaminated water, a bacterium in a grape or a cup. And it did what no human force had ever done. It stopped him. This is perhaps the most disturbing implication of the entire story. Not that great men die. History is dense with the deaths of great men, but that the instrument of their defeat is so often laughably inadequate in comparison to their power. The man who faced down Darius's millions at Gaugamela, who charged directly into the heaviest Persian cavalry at the Granicus, who broke the Theban sacred band, who crossed the Hindu Kush in winter, who survived the Gedrosian desert, who fought on horseback through 8 years of continuous campaigning while being wounded multiple times, including a serious chest wound at the Mali town in India that punctured his lung and nearly killed him. That man was not killed by a rival. He was killed by something that had no interest in his legend, no awareness of his divine heritage, no capacity to be impressed by the altars he built at the Hyphasis, or the cities he named after himself across 12,000 miles of conquered earth. It simply found him, and it ended him, with the indifferent efficiency of nature completing a biological process. He had conquered everything except the one thing that was already inside him, the vulnerability that every human body carries from the first breath to the last. The mortality that Olympias, for all her vivid theology, could not breed out of him. The limitation that Aristotle, for all his philosophical scope, could not reason away. The fact that no spear thrown into the shore of Asia, no oracle's confirmation, no altar built at the edge of the known world, no ring passed to a dying hand could exempt a human being from the jurisdiction of time. The conqueror was conquered. The invincible was destroyed, not by a better general, not by a superior strategy, not by a failure of courage or intelligence or will, by a fever, by time, by the body's own eventual refusal to continue. And here is the implication that the story leaves open, the question that history deposits at our feet and declines to answer. If Alexander, with everything he had, the genius, the drive, the resources, the genuine divine sanction that his world recognized and celebrated, the army of 47,000 who had proven they could beat 1,000,000, if Alexander could not secure himself against this, could not secure his dynasty, and could not secure his legacy in any form more durable than a legend whose details were already being embroidered and invented within years of his death, then what does that tell us about the project of power itself? What does it mean that the greatest accumulation of worldly power in the ancient world dissolved within 2 generations? What does it mean that the man who stamped his name on the geography of 3 continents cannot be found physically anywhere on earth? What does it mean that the altars he built at the edge of the world, the 12 enormous monuments to the 12 Olympian gods at the Hyphasis River, his furthest reach, his final assertion that he had been here, that he had gone further than any human being before him? What does it mean that those altars have never been located? He left no body. He left no tomb. He left no stable empire. He left no heir who survived childhood. He left no succession that endured more than a generation. He left, instead, a story so powerful, so generative, so mythologically rich, that it has been retold in virtually every human culture for 2.5 millennia, adapted and reshaped and projected onto new contexts by every civilization that encountered it, because something in it speaks to something permanent in human experience: the desire to exceed all limits, the collision with the limit that cannot be exceeded, and the strange immortality that comes, not from victory over death, but from the audacity of the attempt. He was 20 years old when he became king. He was 32 when the fever took him. In the 12 years between, he remade the world. The world, eventually, remade him into something no longer fully human, no longer fully historical, something that exists in the charged space between fact and myth, where the most consequential figures in human history tend to end up. Was he great because he conquered, or because he dared to try what no one else would? The question is not rhetorical. It does not have a clean answer. And the fact that it doesn't, the fact that we are still asking it 2,349 years after his death, in a world that would not exist in its current form without the disruptions he caused, suggests that he achieved, by means he could not have anticipated, and by a route that passed directly through his own destruction, exactly the immortality he had been chasing since the day Olympias first read him the Iliad. He found it. It just cost him everything else. What do you think? Was Alexander's greatness defined by his conquests, or by the sheer impossibility of what he attempted? And is there a version of his story where the ending is different, where the empire holds, where the dynasty endures, where the fever never comes? Share your theories in the comments.